If we want to delve into Egyptian mythology, the inevitable starting point is the Nile River. There was no other way. The Nile was not simply a waterway. It was the heartbeat that sustained the life of an entire kingdom. Imagine a territory stretching out like a fertile green strip, enclosed between two vast and austere desert expanses. This corridor of life was the gift of the Nile. For the ancient Egyptians, the river was the material manifestation of Ma'at, the essential idea of order, truth, justice, and universal balance. Ma'at made it possible for the sun to rise, for the constellations to follow their course, and, above all, for the Nile to rise each year. Their civilization depended on this annual flood, so constant and decisive that it ended up shaping their calendar and their religious worldview. Around July, the river began to rise. Far from fearing it, they celebrated it. They knew that these dark waters, laden with fertile mud, would nourish their fields. After several months, the floodwaters receded, leaving behind sediment so rich it seemed supernatural. The harvests were so abundant that they called this land Kemet, the Black Land. For them, this was the very essence of Egypt, the antithesis of the Red Desert, Deseret. This desert embodied Isfet, the force of chaos and dissolution. There, snakes, scorpions, and storms reigned. Isfet contradicted everything Ma'at represented. The Nile gave form and sustenance, while the desert erased and consumed. The river signified life, the desert, death. That is why tombs were built along the desert fringe, so that the deceased would rest in the Red Land, outside the realm of the living, which belonged to the Nile. This tension between the fertile fringe and the desert dominated their worldview and their religious tradition. The constant struggle between order and chaos wasn't just a theory. It was a visible reality every day in their surroundings. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. You can also tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always interesting to discover who's joining us from different places. This is Sleepy History, and my intention is to offer you a story to accompany you as you drift off to sleep. For the Egyptians, the universe didn't end at the banks of the Nile. The river was the earthly reflection of a sacred waterway that the gods traveled in their boats. Ra, the sun god, journeyed by day through the sky and by night through the underworld. This perpetual journey mirrored both the daily movement of the sun and the annual cycle of the floods. The flooding not only ensured food, it was tangible proof that order remained intact. If the river didn't rise, it meant that Ma'at had diminished and chaos was advancing. Survival depended on it. That's why, when thinking about Egyptian mythology, don't just focus on images of gods and pharaohs. Imagine the dark mud beneath your feet, the Nile swelling beyond its banks, and the constant pressure of the desert. Every belief and every custom was tied to that river. The Nile wasn't merely a source of resources. It was the divinity that sustained existence itself. For the ancient Egyptians, the world was not finished. They didn't conceive of it as a piece that is molded once and left to harden. They considered creation an active and repeated process, always in motion. This principle is essential to understanding their view of the universe and their sacred narratives. The best example is the cycle of the sun. Every morning, Ra, the sun god, was reborn in the east. His movement across the sky wasn't just the course of a celestial body. It was a new act of creation, the daily reaffirmation of order over chaos. At nightfall, when Ra disappeared over the western horizon, he descended to the Duat, the underworld, where he confronted the forces of darkness and, especially, the serpent of disorder, Apophis. Ra's nightly victory over Apophis allowed the sun to be reborn the following day. This continuous movement showed that life and order were not permanent, but rather conquests that had to be secured time and again. Similarly, the Nile cycle represented the annual repetition of the primordial moment of creation. Each year the river overflowed, leaving behind silt that renewed the fertility of the soil. For the Egyptians, this flood was not simply a natural phenomenon, but a reenactment of the moment when the earth first emerged from the waters of Nun. The appearance of fertile land after the flood evoked the emergence of Benben from that initial chaos. This idea permeated their entire daily life. The pharaoh, for example, was not only a ruler, but the living embodiment of Horus, protector of order. Their mission was to uphold Ma'at, the balance of the universe. Every ceremony, every temple erected, every offering, was part of the effort to collaborate in this creative cycle, to support the gods in maintaining the stability of the world and preventing its return to Isfet. They did not rely on chance, but rather on rituals and action as tools to influence the cosmos. The priests and temples functioned as guardians of balance, for through their rituals they ensured the sunrise, the flooding of the Nile, and the continuity of life. For the Egyptian mindset, the world was delicate and required constant attention. Creation had not been a single event, but a marvel that was reborn with each dawn and each flood. This vision gave them a clear sense of purpose and a profound reverence for natural rhythms, which were, in essence, the rhythms of existence itself. In the beginning, there was only none, the primordial ocean, a boundless abyss of chaotic waters. It was nothingness, disorder, absolute darkness, a state prior to everything. From that inert ocean, Adam emerged of his own accord. He was neither born nor formed. He simply rose from the waters of none and stood upon the primordial hill called Benben. This act of self-emergence made him the first being and the starting point of all that exists. Alone in the vastness, Adam felt the need to create. Through a solitary act, sometimes described as masturbation and in other versions as a sneeze or a spit, he brought forth the first divine couple, Shu and Tefnut. You can see them as the first fundamental duality. Shu symbolized air and space. Tefnut represented moisture and the life force. They ventured into none, away from Adam. Grieved by their absence, Adam plucked out one of his eyes and sent it to find them. When they returned, the sun god wept with joy, and from those tears, the first human beings were born. Later, Shu and Tefnut gave birth to Geb, god of the earth, and Nut, goddess of the sky. Geb and Nut were so closely united that they held heaven and earth in a continuous embrace. But this union prevented the existence of the world, because there was no space left for life. Adam, through Shu, ordered their separation. Shu interposed himself between them and lifted Nut, thus creating an intermediate space. This moment, the separation of heaven and earth, is one of the most recognized in Egyptian tradition. With this division, the universe took shape, and a habitable realm was created between the earth of Geb and the sky of Nut, sustained by the air of Shu. Despite this distance, Geb and Nut had 4 children: Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. These 9 gods, Adam, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, formed the Ennead of Heliopolis, a central group of deities that shapes the basic structure of creation and life according to Egyptian tradition. This cosmogony, born in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, explains the origin of the world as stemming from a solar act of self-creation. While other narratives rely on primordial chaos or the creative word, here the beginning is the sun, an active force that organizes and gives meaning to the universe. Each deity of the Ennead fulfills a specific function, shaping the world step by step, from the essential elements to the formation of the divine family that would govern the earth. But let's leave behind the image of the sun and self-creation, because the Hermopolis version proposes something entirely different. In this myth, the universe does not arise from order, but from absolute chaos. Everything originated from a group of 8 primordial deities who existed amidst total chaos before the world took shape. These 8 deities, 4 male with frog heads and 4 female with serpent heads, comprised the Ogdoad. Each pair embodied an aspect of the primordial chaos that preceded all form. Nun and Nonnet represented the original water, the abyssal vastness from which everything would emerge. They were the force and matter of the initial disorder. Hu and Ha-He symbolized infinity, the boundless, contourless space that reigned before creation. Kuk and Kakhet embodied darkness, the total absence of light, primordial blindness, the night before dawn. Ammonius and Amunet were the hidden air, the invisible power. They represented the unmanifested creative energy, the latent force that would drive change. The Ogdoad did not act out of conscious intention, but rather through the natural friction between its own chaotic elements. Imagine these 8 deities shifting and colliding in a disordered movement. From this interaction, from the mixture of darkness, water, air, and infinity, something unforeseen emerged. A hill appeared, the Benben, and upon it a cosmic egg. In other narratives, a lotus flower appeared instead of an egg. Within that egg or that flower was Ra, the sun god. With his appearance, light invaded the original darkness. His energy put an end to chaos. The 8 members of the Ogdoad, having fulfilled their purpose, withdrew to the realm of the dead and allowed order to take hold. In some accounts, it is claimed that they are the ones who guarantee the daily rebirth of the sun, sustaining the continuity of creation. This myth from Hermopolis places the origin of the world in chaos, not in a voluntary act. Creation did not arise from a conscious decision, but from the inevitable clash between primordial forces. It is a more abstract and, in some ways, more reflective perspective than that of Heliopolis, where creation derives from a deliberate act. Chaos is not understood as evil, but as the necessary energy that, when ordered, produces the cosmos. The universe is not born from an intention, but from the movement of nothingness. And, unlike the accounts from Heliopolis and Hermopolis, which focus on physical acts such as self-creation or initial chaos, the Memphis version offers a more conceptual conception of creation. In it, the god Ptah does not emerge from a primordial ocean, nor does he generate offspring through a physical act. In this doctrine, Ptah shapes the world through thought and word. The Memphite creation story is preserved on the Shabaka stone, which reproduces an even older text. In that account, Ptah is presented as the absolute creator and the source of all that exists. The other gods, including the Ogdoad of Hermopolis and the Ennead of Heliopolis, are considered manifestations of Ptah. It is a theological position that places Ptah above all other deities. His method of creation is what distinguishes him. The account explains that Ptah first conceived the universe in his heart, understood by the Egyptians as the seat of thought and intelligence. Once the form of the world was complete in his mind, he expressed it with his tongue. In other words, Ptah imagined the universe and then named it, and by naming it, he brought it into existence. The Shabaka stone expresses it as follows. Everything that emerged from Ptah was conceived in the heart and arranged by the tongue. This cosmogony stands out for its level of abstraction. It predates by centuries Greek and later Western philosophical concepts that maintain that creation originates from a logos, a word, or a rational principle. Consider the biblical phrase, "In the beginning was the Word," which resonates with this idea. While the pre-Socratic thinkers sought a material origin for the cosmos, the priests of Memphis were already speaking of an immaterial principle, the divine mind and word. Ptah is not a creator who works with his hands, but one who conceives and gives existence through thought and language. He is the architect of the universe. It is no coincidence that he was the patron of artisans and builders. His creative act, based on reflection and expression, suggests that true creation is not only physical but also intellectual. This doctrine transforms Ptah, originally a local god of Memphis, into a universal deity, the very source of existence and order, a remarkably advanced idea for its time. For the ancient Egyptians, the sun was not a blazing sphere in the sky, but the god Ra, absolute sovereign, the embodiment of order and life. His daily journey was the central event of the cosmos, a perpetual cycle of birth, death, and renewal. The day began on the eastern horizon. Ra, in his form as the sacred scarab beetle Khepri, emerged from the primordial waters of Nun. The scarab, which pushes a ball in which it lays its eggs, perfectly symbolized the sun appearing over the horizon. Khepri represented dawn, youth, and the promise of a new day. When the sun reached its zenith, the god assumed his most powerful form, Ra, the midday sun. In this phase, he traveled in his day bark, accompanied by other deities, maintaining cosmic order and illuminating the world of the living. At dusk, the sun descended in the west and took the form of Adam, the old sun. Adam was the manifestation of the sun nearing its daily end and preparing to enter the Duat, the underworld. This journey was not peaceful, but rather a path fraught with threats, hostile creatures, and battles. Ra's nightly journey was divided into 12 hours, each with its own significance and challenge, as described in funerary texts such as the Book of Amjuat. Hour 1, Ra enters the Duat. He is in a state of transition, venturing into the realm of the dead. Hours 2 and 3, Ra travels through the watery regions of the Duat. The subterranean rivers are filled with obstacles and guardians. Hour 4, the sun god reaches the region of the mounds, where the tombs of the deceased are located. Hour 5, Ra navigates through the realm of Soker, a sandy and desolate region, where the bark must be pulled by the gods. Hour 6, this is the lowest point of the journey, midnight. Ra, in his ram form, unites with the body of Osiris, the god of the dead. This union allowed Ra to rejuvenate and Osiris to symbolically resurrect, linking the solar cycle with the cycle of life and death. Hour 7, the battle against Apophis. This is the most critical hour. If Ra did not defeat the serpent of chaos, dawn would not come, and the world would fall into eternal darkness. Hours 8 to 11. The sun god continues his ascending journey, navigating through the final regions of the underworld, passing through lakes of fire and confronting other demons. Hour 12. Ra emerges from the Duat on the eastern horizon, reborn as Khepri, young and full of life. The defeated serpent is expelled, and the cycle begins again. The battle of Ra against the serpent of chaos was not just a story. It was the central pillar of Egyptian mythology and a direct reflection of the reality they lived. Ra order Mot had to fight every night against Apophis, Chaos, Isfet. This giant serpent, who dwelled in the subterranean waters of the Duat, sought to devour the sun and plunge the universe into eternal darkness. The conflict was not only physical, it was a metaphysical battle. Apophis was not evil in the modern sense. He was the principle of disorder, the antithesis of creation. His existence was necessary, for without chaos there could be no order. But his power had to be contained. If Apophis won, the light of the sun would be extinguished forever. To aid Ra on his nightly journey, the Egyptians performed rituals to ensure the sun god's victory. Priests recited incantations and curses, reading passages from the Book of Amjuat and other funerary texts that contained formulas to weaken Apophis and strengthen Ra. The priests symbolically united themselves with the deities who accompanied the sun god, such as Seth, Thoth, and Mot. In some ceremonies, they created effigies of Apophis from papyrus or wax and destroyed them with spears, knives, or fire. Sometimes they painted the serpent on papyrus or tomb walls and then erased or mutilated it to represent its defeat. The burning of the Book of Apophis's revolt was a ritual preserved in the temples, containing spells and curses to destroy the serpent. The act culminated in the burning of the papyrus, a symbol of the annihilation of evil. This was not theater. These were acts of ritual magic that, according to the Egyptians, had a real effect on the universe. They ensured that Ra's bark could proceed without being devoured and that the cycle of life would continue. Each dawn was proof of its efficacy and a reason to celebrate. The constant threat of darkness was not a cause for terror. It was a force that gave them purpose, a reason to defend order in a world always close to chaos. Over time, Ra was no longer the young god of dawn. The sun aged on Earth, and ungrateful humans began to conspire against him, criticizing his reign. Ra, angered by their treachery, gathered the other gods, including his father, Nun, for counsel. They advised him to send his eye, a manifestation of his power, to punish the rebels. Ra averted his eye, and it took the form of his daughter, Hathor. But the god's fury was so intense that Hathor transformed into a far more terrible creature, the lioness goddess Sekhmet, whose name means the powerful one. Sekhmet, the embodiment of the sun's fiercest and most destructive aspect, descended to Earth. Her mission was clear: to annihilate humanity. At first, humans did not grasp the magnitude of their mistake. Sekhmet, in her bloodlust, began to massacre them by the thousands. The texts describe her as a torrent of fury whose breath was a desert and whose gaze withered life. The gods watched in terror. Ra, seeing the destruction, regretted his decision. The punishment had gone too far. If Sekhmet continued, no one would remain. Ra ordered a halt, but the goddess, intoxicated by violence, could not hear. To save humanity, the god devised a plan. He ordered the brewing of a vast quantity of beer dyed with red ochre to resemble blood. The mixture, produced in such large quantities that it was said to flood the plains, was spread across the land. Sekhmet, seeing the red liquid, believed it was blood. Thirsty, she drank without restraint. She drank so much that she became drunk and fell asleep, reverting to her original form, the serene Hathor. Upon awakening, her thirst for destruction had vanished. Humanity was saved by a narrow margin, thanks to a divine deception and immense intoxication. This tale shows that even gods could repent and that, despite their power, chaos could be contained with ingenuity as well as force. After the massacre and the salvation of humanity, Ra, exhausted and wounded by human betrayal, realized that he could no longer rule the earth directly. He had seen the darkness in the hearts of men, and although he had forgiven them, his trust in them had been broken. Therefore, he decided to withdraw. He would no longer walk among mortals. The myth tells that Ra climbed onto the back of the celestial cow, Nut, and ascended to the heavens. From the sky, he could continue to observe humanity, but without interfering in its world. He left the rule in the hands of the descendants of Geb and Nut, beginning a line that started with his grandson Osiris. This withdrawal marked a turning point in Egyptian mythology. It explained why the pharaoh and not Ra reigned on earth, because although Ra no longer ruled directly, his power flowed through the pharaoh. The pharaoh was not an ordinary man. He was Horus in life, and upon death he transformed into Osiris. He was the living bridge between the gods and men. His most sacred duty was to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance that sustained the universe. Every temple he erected, every ritual he led, every law he enacted, was a reaffirmation of Ra's creative act in his daily journey. The pharaoh was the guarantor that order would not collapse and that chaos, Isfet, would not reclaim the world. When Ra withdrew to the heavens, the earthly kingdom passed to Osiris, the firstborn of Geb and Nut. Osiris was not only a king, he was a civilizer. Before him, humanity lived almost like animals, surviving as best they could. Osiris, along with his sister and wife Isis, changed all that. He was the first teacher. He taught men how to cultivate the land, how to plow the fields, how to sow wheat and barley. He showed them how to create tools, how to harness the Nile's floods to irrigate the crops, and how to transform nature into abundant life. He taught them how to make wine, how to brew beer, and how to store food. But Osiris did not stop at the material. He gave humanity language and law. He established rules, justice, and order. He showed them how to live together, how to respect the gods, and how to build a civilized society. His reign was so prosperous, so just that he became the model of the perfect king. A beloved, wise, and benevolent sovereign, the ideal that all pharaohs were to emulate. If you're listening to me at this point in the video, I hope you're already subscribed to the channel. This is Sleepy History, and I aspire to build a large community of people who love the night and knowledge. Thousands of individuals from different places united by that deep impulse to understand more, to understand themselves better, and to live with greater clarity. I always say it, knowing history is essential to avoid repeating the mistakes that have already marked humanity. That's why I want you to take a few moments to subscribe and share this content with that friend who enjoys learning. And if you ever feel the desire to offer a gesture of support to this storyteller, I will receive it with gratitude, although my gratitude is already present simply for you joining me in this moment. Let's continue. After bringing civilization to Egypt, Osiris embarked on a journey around the world to spread agriculture and knowledge. He left Isis as regent, and her reign became an era of unparalleled harmony and prosperity. This period is known as the first golden age of humanity. It was the foundation of everything that came after. Osiris became a symbol of life, fertility, and balance, qualities made possible by the Nile. This prestige awakened a deep envy in Seth, his younger brother. Seth was the embodiment of the desert, chaos, and violence. In contrast to the serenity and order that Osiris represented, Seth was the heat of the dry wind and the devastating storm. Envy turned to hatred. The most well-known story describes the conspiracy that Seth orchestrated. He commissioned the construction of a perfect casket for Osiris's body and adorned it with metals and gems. During a banquet in his brother's honor, he announced that the casket would belong to whoever fit inside. Everyone tried, but they were unsuccessful. When Osiris lay down, trusting, Seth and his allies closed the lid and sealed it with molten lead. They threw the casket into the Nile so that it would be lost forever. But they were not satisfied with that. Seth retrieved the chest, opened the coffin, and divided Osiris's body into 14 pieces. He scattered them throughout Egypt, intending to prevent any return or rest. It wasn't just murder. It was an absolute act of Isfet, the manifestation of chaos seeking to undo order. By fragmenting the king's body, Seth also sought to fracture the kingdom Osiris had forged. The physical rupture reflected the spiritual and political rupture he intended to impose. The murder of Osiris marked a turning point in mythology. News of the crime reached Isis, who, devastated, began a tireless search for the 14 fragments of Osiris's body. With this murder, the harmonious reign of the gods ended, and one of the most moving stories in Egyptian tradition began. A tale of love, loss, and rebirth. After Seth's act, chaos spread, but Isis, driven by her grief and determination, refused to yield. Isis, the great sorceress and guardian of the throne, embarked on her mission transformed into a kite. She traversed all of Egypt, from the delta to the south. Her weeping accompanied her flight, and the waters of the Nile symbolically fed on her grief. She was not alone. Memphis, her sister and protector of funerary rites, despite being Seth's wife, joined her, horrified by her husband's cruelty. Together they found, one by one, the scattered fragments of Osiris's body. At each site where they found a piece, a sanctuary was erected, which would explain the multitude of tombs dedicated to Osiris in different regions of the country. The last fragment was his penis, devoured by a Nile fish. Although it could not be recovered, Isis fashioned one from clay. Her power ensured that physical absence did not prevent the ritual restoration of the body. Upon gathering the 14 pieces, Isis faced a new challenge. It was necessary to temporarily bring Osiris back to life to ensure an heir. With Memphis and the participation of Anubis, son of Osiris and Memphis and guardian of funerals, they undertook the reassembly of the body. They embalmed and wrapped it, creating the first mummy. This foundational act would become the model for all subsequent funerary practices. Once the body was preserved, Isis once again took the form of a kite and flapped her wings over the mummy, breathing life into it once more. From this final union, she conceived Horus. Horus would be born in the marshy lands of the Delta, hidden from Seth's reach. Isis raised Horus in secret, hidden in the marshes, far from the eyes of the gods and her uncle Seth. Her sole mission was for her son to grow strong enough to avenge his father and restore the lost order. The life, death, and temporary resurrection of Osiris not only cemented the idea of an afterlife, but also justified Horus's right to claim the rightful throne and end Seth's chaotic reign. His birth became a symbol of hope, the triumph of order over chaos, and of a mother who defied everything and everyone for her son's future. Over time, Horus grew into a young god prepared to confront his uncle. What followed was not a simple battle, but a long saga of duels, deceptions, trials, and tests that stretched for 80 years. This titanic conflict was recorded in the myth of the contenders of Horus and Seth, a drama presented before a divine tribunal presided over by Ra. In this cosmic judgment, Horus represented Mot, order, justice, and rightful inheritance. Seth, on the other hand, embodied Isfet, chaos, violence, and brute force. He claimed the throne was his by right of conquest, having defeated his brother. The battles between them were violent and legendary. In one of them, Seth tore out Horus's left eye and dismembered it into 6 pieces, throwing it into the river. Years later, Thoth, god of wisdom, recovered it piece by piece, restored it, and returned it to Horus. That eye, the Ujat, would become one of the most powerful symbols of protection and healing. But it wasn't all about brute force. Intelligence also played its part. In another confrontation, Seth built a stone boat, thinking it would be superior to Horus's wooden one. But his sank in seconds, provoking the general ridicule of the court. On another occasion, he tried to humiliate Horus, but Thoth intervened again, demonstrating that cunning could counterbalance even the most savage strength. The gods were divided. Ra, who understood the value of order but also the indispensable destructive power of the midday sun, saw in Seth a necessary force for balance. However, Isis was not about to let Seth win. Her magic, as powerful as her determination, tipped the scales in her son's favor on several occasions, even influencing Ra himself. Exhausted by the eternal dispute, the gods sought a resolution. And in the midst of it all, one figure stood firm: Thoth, the divine scribe, the guardian of truth, the sage capable of maintaining balance even when the entire universe seemed on the verge of shattering. Thoth was no mere scribe. He was the conscience of the divine tribunal, the guardian of balance, the silent arbiter who ensured that truth was not lost amidst the cries of chaos. Without him, the trial between Horus and Seth would have been a pointless dispute, an endless mess. But thanks to his wisdom, every piece of evidence was recorded, every lie exposed, and every decision made justly. Throughout the conflict, Thoth intervened time and again. He restored Horus's eye, exposed Seth's deceptions, and held the fragile thread of Mot within the tribunal. Finally, after 80 years, the decision was made: Horus was the rightful heir. He represented order, justice, and the continuity of the cycle created by Osiris. Seth, though defeated, was not destroyed. His role in the universe was necessary, and so he was granted a place on the solar bark, fighting each night alongside Ra against the serpent Apophis. Chaos could not be eliminated, only contained. With Horus's victory, the figure of the pharaoh was forever legitimized. The pharaoh in life was Horus, the living king, the guardian of order, the intermediary between the gods and humans. His mission was monumental: to maintain Mot, to protect the kingdom from Isfet, to ensure that the waters of the Nile continued to flow, and that the sun would be reborn each day. His power stemmed not from military might or human inheritance, but from a divine connection that elevated him above all other mortals. And upon death, the pharaoh became Osiris, the king of the afterlife, the guarantor of order in the invisible world. This perfect cycle, Horus in life, Osiris in death, was the essence of the Egyptian monarchy. Each pharaoh formed a link in an eternal chain of divine power that was never broken. This theology was not confined to sacred texts. It lived in propaganda, in temples, in monuments. Narmer, the unifier of Egypt, appears on his famous pallet striking an enemy while Horus, in the form of a falcon, watches from above. It was not merely politics. It was a divine proclamation. The unification of Egypt was a sacred act. Centuries later, the intact tomb of Tutankhamun would reveal the extent to which this belief shaped every detail of a pharaoh's life and death. Everything, his mask, his amulets, his chests, his rituals, was designed to transform him into Osiris and ensure his eternity. His tomb was a map to the afterlife, a guide for his soul to be reborn. And in times of power and glory, pharaohs like Ramses II took this theology to its extreme. In the reliefs of Abu Simbel, he is depicted fighting alone against thousands, while the gods protect him. Although the Battle of Kadesh ended in a draw, the walls tell another story. The story of a living, invincible Horus, guided by Ammonius Ra. In art, Ramses was not a man, he was a god on earth. These depictions were not exaggerations. They were proof that, for the Egyptians, the pharaoh did not rule alone. He ruled with the gods. He ruled as a god. Ramses, surrounded in the heat of battle, raised his voice to Ammonius. The texts say that the god responded with a thunderclap. "I have given you the strength of a god." It was not just divine intervention. It was pure propaganda, a reminder to all that the pharaoh was not a mere king, but a god-king walking the earth. For the ancient Egyptians, death did not signify the end, but a transition, a crossing into another form of existence. But this journey was not simple. Their vision of humankind was far more complex than ours. They did not believe in a single soul, but in several parts that had to reunite in the afterlife to achieve immortality. For them, the human being was a cosmic puzzle. The most essential piece was the Ka, the life force, the energy that animated the body. It was born with the person, always accompanied them, and was the divine spark that made it possible to live, eat, and breathe. When someone died, the Ka did not disappear. It needed a home. That is why there were tombs, statues, and chambers filled with offerings. They were not for the corpse. They were to nourish the Ka in eternity. Next came the Ba, the personality, that which made each individual unique. The Ba could move freely between this world and the next. That is why it was represented as a bird with a human head. A soul that traveled by day among the living and returned by night to its tomb. If the Ba did not find its body, it was lost forever. Hence the absolute importance of mummification. Without a body, there was no possible return. The third fundamental element was the Ak, the transfigured spirit. It was not born with the person. It was obtained only after death and successfully passing the judgment of Osiris. Only those declared righteous of voice could become the Ak. And this glorified state granted something incomparable: eternity, timeless existence. To this were added other equally sacred aspects: the shadow, inseparable from the being, and the name, the run, which contained the very essence of identity. To erase someone's name, as they did with Akhenaten, was to condemn them to disappear in the afterlife as well. For them, to die was to be fragmented. The body on one hand, the Ka, the Ba, the shadow, the name, all separated. And funerary rituals existed for a single purpose: to reunite all those pieces, to reconstruct the puzzle, and to allow the individual to live forever. Mummification was not simply a preservation process. It was a sacred act. Without an intact body, the Ka had no home, and the Ba could not find its way back. It was the difference between rebirth or being lost forever. The process lasted 70 days and was performed by priests dressed as Anubis, the jackal-headed god. It all began with the most delicate step: the removal of the organs. An incision was made in the side of the body, and the liver, intestines, stomach, and lungs were removed. None of this was discarded. Each organ was carefully preserved and placed in canopic jars, protected by the 4 sons of Horus. Duamutev, in the form of a jackal, guarded the stomach. Kabesanuf, the falcon, protected the intestines. Happy, depicted as a baboon, guarded the lungs. Amset, with a human face, watched over the liver. The heart remained in the body because, for the Egyptians, it was the center of thought, emotions, and judgment. Without it, there was no life in the afterlife. The brain, on the other hand, was extracted through the nose with a hook and discarded, as it was considered to have no value. Then came dehydration. The body was completely covered with natron, a natural salt that absorbed all moisture. It remained like this for 40 days until completely dry. Then it was washed and anointed with aromatic oils and resins. The wrapping was a ritual in itself. Hundreds of meters of linen enveloped the body, and between each layer, amulets and jewels were placed to protect the deceased on their journey. Each one had a specific purpose. The heart scarab, for example, was placed on the chest to ensure that the heart would not testify against the deceased during the final judgment. When the process was complete, the mummy was placed in its sarcophagus. It was the beginning of its journey to the underworld, the first step toward eternity. The newly deceased soul awoke in the Duat, the vast and complex Egyptian underworld. It was not a static place, but a dynamic realm that mirrored the earthly world. It was under the dominion of Osiris and divided into 12 regions that corresponded to the 12 hours of the sun's nightly journey in the solar bark. Now that the Ka and the Ba were reunited, the soul needed guidance. That guidance was the Book of the Dead. It wasn't a book in the modern sense, but a collection of incantations, formulas, and sacred maps written on papyrus or engraved on tomb walls. Its purpose was to give the deceased the exact words and knowledge needed to overcome every obstacle. Throughout the 12 hours of the Duat, the soul had to face trials of all kinds, including lakes of fire that it had to cross without being consumed. The incantations indicated how to proceed, what to say, what name to utter, and how to keep at bay the guardians who tried to impede its passage. The Duat was filled with giant serpents, demons, and monstrous guardians that blocked the paths. The deceased had to know their names and the precise incantations to calm or intimidate them. There were desolate regions, veritable wastelands of sand and darkness, where even the soul's boat had to be pulled by deities to move forward. The journey through the Duat was a constant reminder that life in the afterlife was not simply obtained upon death, but had to be earned. It was a test of knowledge, faith, and morality that ensured only the worthy would attain immortality. If the soul overcame all the dangers of the Duat, it reached the culmination of its journey, the final judgment. This judgment took place in the Hall of the Two Truths, where the deceased was presented before 42 divine judges. There, the deceased recited the negative confession, a series of declarations in which they affirmed that they had not committed any forbidden acts, such as, "I have not killed," "I have not stolen," and "I have not lied." This oath demonstrated that they had lived according to the principles of Ma'at, truth, and order. The decisive moment of the judgment was the weighing of the heart. The deceased's heart, considered the center of morality and conscience, was placed on one side of the scales. On the other lay the feather of Ma'at, symbol of justice and truth. Anubis oversaw the balance, while Thoth carefully recorded the result. If the heart was as light as the feather, the deceased was declared righteous and worthy of eternal life. But danger lurked nearby. Beside the scales stood Amit, the devourer of souls, with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hind legs of a hippopotamus. If the heart was heavier than the feather, laden with evil, Amit would devour it. To be devoured by Amit meant total annihilation, the dreaded second death that condemned the soul to absolute oblivion. If the heart managed to pass the test, the deceased was proclaimed righteous and proceeded to the field of reeds, an idealized paradise on the Nile where they would live eternally in peace. The judgment was not a punishment, but a validation, the final confirmation that eternal life was a privilege reserved for those who had lived in harmony with order and truth. The official religion, with its complex ceremonies, colossal temples, and sacrifices organized by the pharaohs and priests, could seem distant to ordinary people. The life of a priest at Karnak bore no resemblance to that of a farmer in the Nile Valley. For most Egyptians, religion was not lived in grand monuments, but in the home, in the fields, and in everyday decisions. Popular religion was an intimate and practical system, geared toward protecting the family and ensuring prosperity. While kings and priests concerned themselves with the fate of the cosmos and the journey of the sun, ordinary people focused on the health of their children, the security of their homes, and the success of their harvests. They had no access to the inner sanctuaries of the temples, spaces reserved exclusively for royalty and the clergy. Instead of going to temples, people had their own methods for interacting with the divine. The use of amulets was a fundamental practice, as these small objects were believed to be imbued with the power of the gods and could protect against worldly dangers. They came in all shapes and sizes, from the popular Husiat, the Eye of Horus, which protected against the evil eye and illness, to the sacred scarab, which symbolized resurrection. Egyptians wore them around their necks, tied to their arms, or even sewn onto their clothing. For them, they were a kind of magical armor against chaos and malevolent forces. Statues of gods were also common in homes. These were not the monumental colossi of temples, but small clay or wooden figures placed on household altars. There, offerings of food, drink, or incense were made to communicate with the divine, ask for favors, and honor ancestors. This folk theology was direct and profoundly practical. It did not rely on complex sacred texts, but rather on oral tradition and magical rituals that sought to ensure protection and daily prosperity. While great gods like Ra, Osiris, and Isis dominated the official religion, ordinary people frequently turned to a group of more familiar deities, linked to the home and daily life. Among these, Bes and Tard stood out as two essential figures in the domestic pantheon. Bes was a peculiar god, depicted as a bearded dwarf with a broad face, bulging eyes, and a protruding tongue, sometimes sporting comical expressions. Although his appearance might seem grotesque, he was a valiant guardian and a relentless protector. He was the god of joy, music, and dance, but above all, he was the defender of the home. He was believed to drive away demons and evil spirits that tried to enter houses. He was also the protector of children and women during childbirth. For this reason, statuettes of Bes were placed at the entrances of homes or beside children's beds to ensure their safety. Tard, the goddess with the body of a hippopotamus, the paws of a lion, and the back of a crocodile, was another essential figure for the protection of the home. Despite her intimidating appearance, she was considered a kind and maternal presence. Her name means the Great One, and she was especially invoked to care for pregnant women and newborns. In an era when childbirth was fraught with risks, Tard was seen as the supreme protector. Her amulets and statuettes were placed in homes to ensure a safe delivery and the health of both mother and baby. Her fierce appearance was no accident, as she was believed to need that strength to ward off the demons that preyed on women and children in their most vulnerable moments. Bes and Tard represented the approachable and benevolent side of Egyptian mythology. They did not rule the sun or the underworld, but they were the gods in whom people placed their trust to face daily life. Their presence in everyday life demonstrated that, for the Egyptians, religion was not a distant matter reserved for temples and rulers, but a flexible system that responded to their needs and cared for what they valued most, their homes and families. Magic, called Hika, was not seen as an act of deception or a force contrary to nature. It was understood as a primordial energy, existing even before the gods, and considered the very foundation of the creative process. Hika was the tool through which the gods acted and, by extension, a means for humans to relate to the universe. The god Hika was conceived as a protective deity who accompanied Ra on his nightly journey, and his power sustained every ritual. When a priest uttered a spell or a physician prepared a remedy, they were not asking for divine favor, but rather applying this essential force to influence reality. It was a form of knowledge, almost a sacred science that contributed to the maintenance of Ma'at, the order of the world. Priests invoked Hika to ensure the dawn and the Nile's flooding. Ordinary people used it to ward off illnesses, harmful spirits, and everyday dangers. Amulets, figurines, and medical texts functioned as instruments of this energy. It was not enough to address a god. It was necessary to correctly activate his power. Magic was action, a direct participation in the universal balance. Myths permeated every aspect of life. Stories like that of Osiris and the Nile cycle were experienced with each agricultural season. The river was a physical reality, but also the manifestation of the god Hapi, whose flood deposited fertile silt. Each time the Nile's level rose, offerings and ritual words were recited to ensure a beneficial flood. Sowing symbolically reenacted the burial of Osiris, a death necessary for rebirth. Germination was the tangible expression of his resurrection. The harvest celebrated the continuity of order and the victory of life. From birth to death, an Egyptian's existence was permeated by these rites. Pregnant women invoked protective deities such as Bes and Tard. Children were protected with songs and amulets against the evil eye. Funerary rites, from the mummification process to the opening of the mouth that allowed the deceased to speak and eat in the afterlife, were manifestations of Jekka. These were not mere customs, but rather the way in which the Egyptians ensured that everything, from the universe to domestic life, remained in balance. Their mythology was not rigid. With political changes, the religious structure also transformed. A central element of this transformation was syncretism, the merging of local gods with major deities to form divine beings with combined attributes. This did not imply the disappearance of the original gods, but rather a superimposition that strengthened both identities. The most prominent example was the union of Ammonius with Ra during the New Kingdom. Ammonius, initially a local deity of Thebes, gained importance as the city rose politically. When the Theban pharaohs consolidated their rule over Egypt, they elevated their patron god to the top of the pantheon. Instead of replacing Ra, they merged him with Ra to create Ammonius Ra, sovereign of the gods. This deity combined the creative and solar power of Ra with the secretive nature of Ammonius, whose name means the hidden one. He was a solar god who expressed himself in both light and the invisible air. His cult spread throughout the territory, and the Temple of Karnak became the largest and most opulent religious complex in the ancient world. The pharaohs proclaimed themselves sons of Ammon-Ra, thus reinforcing their authority. This syncretism extended to other figures as well. Dasokur Osiris united the creator of Memphis, the funerary god of Saqqara, and the ruler of the underworld, forming a deity that encompassed creation, death, and rebirth. Sobuk-Ra integrated the crocodile god, associated with fertility and strength, with the sun god. This practice allowed local cults to maintain their relevance within a unified state and reinforced the complexity of the official religion. It was a mechanism of integration that ensured cohesion in a country in constant transformation, demonstrating the flexibility of Egyptian theology. This evolution underwent a profound rupture under the reign of Akhenaten, pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Known at birth as Amenhotep IV, he promoted an unprecedented reform, abandoning traditional polytheism and centering worship on a single god, Aten. This act contradicted centuries of religious practice and was later labeled the Amarna heresy. Aten was the solar disk, but Akhenaten elevated it to a singular and exclusive status. Akhenaten proclaimed that Aten was not merely a manifestation of Ra, but the sole creator deity of the universe. His cult centered on the idea that the sun's light and heat were the absolute source of life, and that this power resided solely in the solar disk, which illuminated everyone equally. Akhenaten declared himself the sole intermediary between Aten and humankind, breaking with the age-old tradition in which pharaohs were incarnations of Horus and priests acted as mediators between the divine and earthly realms. This reform had profound political and artistic repercussions. The pharaoh ordered the demolition of temples dedicated to the traditional gods and the erasure of their names from monuments, especially those of Ammon-Ra, the most influential deity in the country. He also founded a new capital, Amarna, built in the middle of the desert, far from the power of the Theban priests. The art of this period changed radically. It abandoned formal rigidity to adopt a more naturalistic and approachable style. Representations of Akhenaten and his family appear with elongated heads, prominent bellies, and soft features that reflect the new theology centered on the pharaoh's personal relationship with his god. However, his revolution was short-lived. Several forces opposed it. The first was the powerful priestly caste of Ammon-Ra, which lost its influence, wealth, and place in the political structure. Naturally, they resisted the elimination of their gods and their own dismantling. The second reason was the disconnection from the people. Traditional religion addressed everyday needs. Best protected children, Taret oversaw childbirth, and the rituals of Osiris guaranteed a good life in the afterlife. Aten, on the other hand, was an abstract, distant god without myths with which people could identify. Only the pharaoh could communicate with him, which generated rejection and fear, especially since this reform denied the traditional conception of the afterlife. The third cause of the failure was political instability. Akhenaten dedicated himself so much to his religious revolution that he neglected foreign relations and the administration of the empire. This led to territorial losses and internal disorder. After his death, restoring order became a priority. His successors, especially his son Tutankhamun, completely undid his changes. They reopened the temples of Ammon-Ra, reinstated the traditional cult, and erased Akhenaten's name from monuments. In the Egyptian mindset, erasing someone's name was to condemn them to disappear forever, a punishment reserved for those considered a threat to the balance of the world. Akhenaten's religious attempt was a singular episode, a one-man effort to redefine power and spirituality. Although he did not succeed in permanently transforming the religious system, he made it clear that the people's beliefs were deeply rooted and that, for the Egyptians, a diverse pantheon was more meaningful than a single god. After more than 3,000 years of continuity, the arrival of the Greeks and then the Romans marked a decisive turning point in Egyptian history. With the conquest of Alexander the Great around 330 BC, Egypt became part of the Hellenistic world under the Ptolemaic dynasty. This change did not imply the disappearance of Egyptian mythology, but rather the beginning of a process of cultural fusion that gave it new forms. The Ptolemies understood that to govern such an ancient land, they had to respect its traditions. Pharaohs like Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II adopted pharaonic protocol, built temples in the traditional style, and integrated Greek and Egyptian beliefs. From this adaptation arose the cult of Serapis, a deity created to appeal to both Egyptians and Greeks. His name combined Osiris and the sacred Apis bull, linking resurrection with fertility and strength. But Serapis also incorporated Greek elements: Zeus's beard, Apollo's crown, and Asclepius's serene expression, along with the three-headed dog that evoked Hades. His cult transcended Egyptian borders and spread throughout the Mediterranean, reaching cities like Athens, Rome, and London. It represented fertility, prosperity, and dominion over life and death, demonstrating how Egyptian religion could transform without losing its essence. However, the end of this tradition was inevitable. With the expansion of the Roman Empire and, above all, with the spread of Christianity, the ancient pharaonic religion began to fade. Christian monotheism, centered on a single god and salvation through faith, directly opposed the multiple pantheon and ancestral Egyptian rites. The persecution of pagan cults by Christian emperors accelerated the process. Ceremonies were banned, priests persecuted, and the temples, the heart of spiritual life for millennia, were abandoned or converted into churches. The Temple of Philae was the last to close its doors in 535 AD, marking the official end of the living religion of the ancient Egyptians. But this end was accompanied by an even more painful loss. The knowledge of hieroglyphs disappeared along with the last priests who could still read them. The inscriptions that once recounted myths, rituals, and divine feats fell silent, incomprehensible symbols to future generations. The temples filled with sand, the reliefs were hidden, and, as the centuries passed, people completely forgot their meaning. The monuments that had defined an entire civilization were transformed into silent enigmas. The religion, art, and history of Egypt lay buried under more than 1,400 years of oblivion. That silence ended in 1799, when the Rosetta Stone unexpectedly came to light during the French campaign in Egypt. A soldier named Pierre-François Bouchard found a black slab of granodiorite among the ruins of a fortress near Rosetta. At first glance, it looked like just another stone, but its three engraved texts, hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek, made it a unique treasure. The decree in Greek honored King Ptolemy V and explicitly mentioned that the same text was written in the other two scripts. For the first time in over a millennium, there was a key to attempting to reconstruct the lost language of the pharaohs. For decades, numerous scholars tried to decipher it without success. Real progress came with Jean-François Champollion, a brilliant linguist who understood what others had missed. Hieroglyphs were not just decorative symbols, but a complex system that combined signs with meaning and sounds. His strategy was to analyze the cartouches, those ovals that enclosed the royal names. By comparing the hieroglyphs for Ptolemy's name with their Greek equivalents and using his vast knowledge of Coptic, Champollion was able to identify the sounds hidden behind the signs. That discovery was the key that unlocked the doors to Egypt's past, giving voice back to a civilization that had remained silent for centuries. He then applied his method to other cartouches, including Cleopatra's, and confirmed his hypothesis. In 1822, he communicated his findings to the French Academy by letter. After years of effort, the result had finally arrived. Knowledge lost for over 1,000 years was brought back to light, and ancient Egypt, with its mythology, history, and culture, was reclaiming its voice. The Rosetta Stone was not merely an archaeological discovery, but the impetus that sparked the rebirth of Egyptology. If that stone restored the voice of the ancient Egyptians, the pharaonic tombs restored their hearts. The discovery of intact tombs not only revealed treasures, but also opened a direct window into their beliefs about death and the afterlife. The clearest example is the tomb of the young Tutankhamun. Before 1922, most royal tombs had been looted, and archaeologists had to reconstruct funerary beliefs from scattered remains. But the tomb discovered by Howard Carter in the Valley of the Kings was virtually untouched. More than a discovery, it was a revelation. Tutankhamun's funerary goods were not simply a collection of riches. Each piece had a ritual purpose and a spiritual significance. The funerary mask, made of more than 10,000 grams of pure gold, was not just a masterpiece. It represented one of the forms of the funerary deity into which the pharaoh transformed after death, allowing him to act in the afterlife. Inside the sarcophagus, his body had been carefully mummified and wrapped. This process ensured that his soul, the Ka and the Ba, could recognize its earthly form and attain eternity. The objects surrounding the sarcophagus were also essential. There were canopic jars containing his internal organs, protected by the 4 sons of Horus according to ancient accounts. Divine statuettes, amulets, and jewelry were found with incantations intended to protect the king on his journey through the Duat. The sarcophagus was covered with scenes from the Book of the Dead, a map of the underworld that granted him the knowledge necessary to face dangers, creatures, and trials until reaching the final judgment. Tutankhamun's tomb confirmed and contextualized the myths that Egyptologists had deciphered thanks to the Rosetta Stone and other papyri. It showed that beliefs about the afterlife were not superstitions, but a spiritual system reflected in every object, rite, and inscription. Discoveries like this one allowed for a direct understanding of the complexity of funerary ceremonies, the significance of mummification, and the profound Egyptian desire to conquer death and be reborn as glorified beings. Egyptian art was not mere decoration. It was a sacred language. Every stroke, every color, and every gesture in its reliefs upheld Ma'at, the order of the universe. Unlike modern art, focused on novelty, Egyptian art sought stability and precision. Hieroglyphs are the best proof of this. They were not just a written system, but images with their own inherent power. The term hieroglyph comes from Greek and means sacred writing. For the Egyptians, the signs had the power to give life to the words they represented. When a funerary incantation was inscribed on a tomb wall, it was not only read, it was activated. This is why certain animals were depicted with a knife, a way of nullifying their power and preventing them from harming the deceased in the afterlife. The image of the gods played an equally crucial role. Egyptian deities were often depicted with animal heads that symbolized their qualities. Horus, god of the sky and kingship, had the head of a falcon. This animal, soaring across the heavens, expressed his strength and his connection to the sun. Anubis, god of mummification, had the head of a jackal. These animals roamed desert cemeteries, so they became symbols of death and funerary rituals. Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, had the head of an ibis, a bird of the Nile marshes considered methodical and prudent. The colors were also laden with meaning. Green and black evoked the fertility of the Nile and rebirth, while red and white were associated with the desert and chaos. Every element in a work was a key to understanding a broader cosmology. Horus is one of the most important and complex deities in the Egyptian pantheon. His image as a falcon or as a man with a falcon's head is no coincidence. The falcon was lord of the sky, and its eyes were identified with the sun and the moon. His myth narrates the triumph of order over chaos. His birth and his confrontation with Seth made him the legitimate heir of Osiris. It is not just a story of revenge, but the foundation of the pharaonic monarchy. The pharaoh, while alive, was seen as the earthly manifestation of Horus, the god who ruled the world of the living. His authority did not depend on lineage, but on a divine bond. The Eye of Horus, the Udjat, is one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. After being torn out by Seth in battle, Thoth restored it with his power. The recovered eye became an amulet of protection, healing, and renewal. Horus's influence within the pantheon extended beyond government and royalty. He was a god associated with war and hunting, an expression of strength and skill. He was also a protector of children and was invoked to ward off illness. Overall, Horus embodied order and justice in all its manifestations. The figure of Anubis, with his recognizable jackal head, identifies him as guardian of cemeteries and god of death, although his role is broader. Jackals, predators that roamed desert necropolises, were linked to death and decay. However, Anubis was not a fearsome presence, but a benevolent deity who accompanied and protected the deceased. He was considered the creator of mummification. In the myth, He helped Isis embalm Osiris and transformed his father's fragmented body into the first mummy. This act made him the patron of all funerary rites. The priests in charge of mummification wore Anubis's jackal mask to invoke his protection. At the Last Judgment, he led the soul of the deceased to the Hall of Two Truths and oversaw the weighing of the heart before the feather of Mot. His presence ensured impartiality and justice. After the judgment, he accompanied the soul to its destination in the field of reeds. For this reason, he was a god of transition rather than death, a guarantor of safe passage to the afterlife. With his ibis or baboon head, Thoth represented wisdom, writing, and magic. The ibis, which fed in marshes, was seen as a reflective creature, while the baboon was associated with intelligence and the solar rebirth due to its behavior at dawn. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, responsible for recording events, decrees, and verdicts. In the trial between Horus and Seth, he acted as mediator, ensuring a just resolution. In the final judgment of humans, he recorded the result of the weighing of the heart and declared whether a soul deserved eternal life. He was also credited with the creation of hieroglyphs, making him a master of magic, since the written word possessed the power to confer life. He was the patron of scribes, a highly valued group in Egyptian society. Furthermore, he was the god of the moon, the calendar, and scientific knowledge, and was considered the author of ancient texts on magic, medicine, and astronomy. Thoth was, in short, reason, intellectual order, and the magical force that gave structure to the universe. His figure complemented the power of Horus and the guidance of Anubis, forming a cycle that encompassed governance, existence, death, and knowledge. For the Egyptians, magic was neither artifice nor an opposition to nature. It was Eka, a primordial energy present since the beginning of time. Eka was the force that drove creation, the energy that allowed the creator god to form the universe and the other deities to manifest their will. It was not superstition, but a kind of sacred physics. Its importance was such that it was personified in its own god, the god Eka, often depicted with a ram's head, a symbol of power and virility. His role was to protect the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the Duat, keeping the serpent of chaos, Apophis, at bay. For the Egyptians, the entire universe functioned thanks to Eka. Rituals were not mere prayers. They were acts that used this energy to directly influence the cosmic order. When a priest uttered a spell or a physician applied a remedy, they were not asking for divine favors. They were manipulating the force of Eka, a form of knowledge that allowed them to maintain Mot, the balance of the world. This energy was used for everything: personal protection, healing, fertility, and agricultural prosperity. Magic was, therefore, an essential tool that allowed humans to actively participate in the workings of the cosmos. In this context, priests were not just religious figures. They were experts in the science of magic. Known as reader priests, they guarded sacred knowledge, rituals, and incantations. Their role was vital. In the great temples, like that of Amonia-Sare at Karnak, they performed daily ceremonies that ensured the sun would rise again, the Nile would flood, and the universe would remain in order. They knew how to honor the gods, what offerings to present, and what words of power to recite. On a daily level, the priest-magician was indispensable to ordinary people. They acted as doctors, healers, and exorcists. They used their mastery of Eka to diagnose illnesses and cure them with remedies, spells, and amulets. Medical texts show how they combined practical knowledge with magic. A spell to close a wound, for example, was not just a prayer. It mimicked a divine act to stop the bleeding and restore health. Mastery of hieroglyphs was fundamental to their power. Because the Egyptians believed that each sign possessed life, the priest gave real existence to the spell by writing it. He was the bridge between mortals and the gods, the intermediary who harnessed the power of Eka for order, health, and life. Long before the Book of the Dead or the funerary scenes we see today in the Valley of the Kings, the pharaohs were already preparing for eternity. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the burial chambers of the Old Kingdom pharaohs, are the oldest and most enigmatic evidence of beliefs about life after death. These were not books in the modern sense, but rather sets of spells and magical formulas whose purpose was to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition into an AK, a glorified spirit dwelling among the gods. They served as a guide for the journey to the afterlife, guaranteeing the king would overcome obstacles, identify with the deities, and reach the imperishable stars of the night sky. At this early stage, immortality was the exclusive privilege of the pharaoh. The texts included precise instructions, such as the names of guardians of the underworld and words of power to open doors and overcome dangers. The vision of the afterlife here differed from that known in later periods. The emphasis was not on the judgment of Osiris, but on celestial ascent. Some spells allowed the pharaoh to transform into a bird or insect to fly alongside the gods, join Ra in his solar bark, or take his place among the circumpolar stars, a symbol of eternity. There was no judgment of souls. By his divine nature, the king went directly to heaven. These texts, with their poetic and sometimes cryptic language, are the foundation of all Egyptian funerary literature. Concepts such as the Ka and the Ba were already present, and the first mummification rituals sought to ensure that the body was prepared for resurrection. From its beginnings, Egyptian civilization displayed a profound conviction. Death was a doorway, and eternity, the final destination. With the end of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh's power waned, and regional rulers gained influence. This political shift brought a decisive theological change. Eternal life, previously reserved only for the king, began to extend to the nobility and high officials. Knowledge and rituals of the afterlife ceased to be the exclusive privilege of royalty. This transformation is reflected in the coffin texts, inscriptions painted or carved on the wooden coffins of the elite. Unlike the pyramid texts, these incantations were placed directly on the coffin, making them more accessible. While many reproduced ancient formulas, they also included new texts that displayed a more practical and universal view of existence after death. The coffin texts marked a profound change. They democratized immortality. What had once been the pharaoh's absolute privilege could now be attained by anyone with the necessary resources. Eternal life ceased to be exclusive and became accessible, at least to those who could afford it. But this new vision of the afterlife was not simple. Unlike the pyramid texts, which focused on the celestial ascent, the coffin texts described a much more complex underworld. The Duat. There, the journey was personal, full of obstacles, dangerous creatures, and forces that could destroy the soul if it was unprepared. Therefore, these texts functioned as a practical guide, almost a manual for spiritual survival. There were spells for absolutely everything: to avoid hunger and thirst, to repel snakes and demons, to escape forced labor thanks to the Asheptis, small magical figures that performed tasks on behalf of the deceased, and to transform into sacred animals capable of overcoming the dangers of the journey. Magical knowledge became as important as social status. The judgment of Osiris wasn't yet the central focus, but the idea that the soul could face punishment without the proper incantations was already emerging. Salvation depended less on the divine and more on knowledge and money. Over time, this opening up of the afterlife culminated in the most famous funerary text of all Egyptian civilization, the Book of the Dead. It wasn't a book in the modern sense, but rather a flexible collection of some 200 incantations written on papyrus, bandages, or tomb walls. Each set could be tailored to the budget and needs of the deceased, making it the most accessible way to secure a place in eternity. Any citizen who could afford papyrus and a scribe had, quite literally, access to immortality. Its purpose remained the same as in earlier times: to guide the soul through the Duat. There were spells to open doors, to confront demons, to obtain food and water, and to transform into guardian animals. But, unlike its predecessors, this book emphasized the final judgment. The journey culminated in the Hall of the Two Truths, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Mot. If the heart was light, the soul reached the eternal field of reeds. If it was heavy, it was devoured by Ammit, condemning the individual to the second and final death. The Book of the Dead did not merely guide, it prepared. It offered the necessary incantations to ensure that the heart would not testify against the deceased, to guarantee that the judgment would favor truth and justice. It was the culmination of millennia of funerary tradition and, above all, the definitive manual for achieving eternity. Egyptian art was not mere decoration or individual expression as it might be understood today. It was, above all, functional and ritualistic. For the Egyptians, a work of art did not simply represent something. It brought it into being. A painting of food in a tomb was not a symbol. It was actual sustenance for the deceased's ka in the afterlife. The image acted as a magical conduit, guaranteeing their eternal presence. That is why their style followed strict rules. The goal was not to reproduce reality, but to ensure clarity, permanence, and effectiveness. The classical pose, with the head in profile, the eye facing forward, the torso facing forward, and the legs in profile, allowed every essential part of the body to be displayed. If everything was visible, everything could function in the afterlife. Funerary sculpture followed the same principle. It was not a personal portrait, but an alternate body in case the mummy was damaged. It was a guarantee of continuity. The presence of animals in divine iconography was also not an arbitrary aesthetic device. It reflected how the Egyptians interpreted the natural world. Each animal possessed qualities that made it a direct symbol of divine power. Anubis had the head of a jackal for a practical reason. Jackals roamed desert cemeteries. Instead of fearing them, the Egyptians associated them with guiding and protecting the dead. Thus arose the guardian of the necropolises. Horus was linked to the falcon because he was a lord of the sky, a creature capable of soaring higher than any other and observing everything from above. His association with the sun, royalty, and the power of the pharaoh was logical. His eyes, according to myth, were the sun and the moon, marking the daily cycle. Thoth was represented as an ibis, a solitary and contemplative bird of the Nile marshes, whose behavior made it an emblem of wisdom, writing, and knowledge. He could also appear as a baboon, another animal considered intelligent. These animal forms were not disguises. They were direct manifestations of each god's qualities. Magic was part of daily life. It was not an abstraction, but an active force called Hika. And the most common way to access that power was through amulets, objects of power that people used to protect themselves, influence their destiny, or keep within their reach what they wished to secure. Amulets were not mere ornaments. They were magical devices intended to protect and sustain the wearer, both in this life and the next. The Eye of Horus, or Udjat, is the most well-known. According to myth, Horus's left eye was gouged out by Seth and restored by Thoth. Therefore, it represented healing, integrity, and defense against the evil eye and envy. It was used by the living as constant protection and placed on mummies to ensure regeneration in the afterlife. The scarab beetle was another fundamental amulet. The Egyptians observed the dung beetle pushing its ball of dung to lay its eggs and associated this act with Khepri, the god who propelled the sun each morning. The scarab symbolized rebirth and permanence. For this reason, scarabs were placed over the hearts of mummies to ensure that the deceased could transcend death and be reborn as an Ak, a glorified spirit. The Djed pillar represented the column of Osiris. It symbolized stability, permanence, and triumph over death. Raising the Djed was an annual ritual that celebrated the resurrection of Osiris and the renewal of the pharaoh's power. In the mummification process, the organs were not discarded. They were fundamental for existence in the afterlife, so they were removed, preserved, and stored in canopic jars, made of limestone or alabaster and placed next to the body in the sarcophagus. Each jar had a lid in the shape of one of the four sons of Horus. Each one protected an essential organ. Amset, with a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, with a baboon's head, the lungs. Duamutef, with a jackal's head, the stomach. Kapsanuf, with a falcon's head, the intestines. The heart was left in the body because it was indispensable for the final judgment. The canopic jars showed how mythology, science, and ritual were intertwined. By preserving the organs and assigning them divine guardians, the Egyptians ensured that the deceased had everything necessary to complete their journey through the underworld and reach eternity in the field of reeds. Over time, Egyptian myths did not disappear abruptly. They blended, adapted, and transformed. It was a final respite before being displaced by new traditions. This process of blending, known as syncretism, became especially visible with the arrival of the Greeks and Romans. With the arrival of Alexander the Great and the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers sought to unify their Egyptian and Hellenic peoples. Thus was born the cult of Serapis, a deity created from the fusion of Osiris and Apis with attributes of Zeus and Hades. He was depicted with a Greek beard, but maintained his connection to fertility and the underworld, which made him relatable to the Egyptians. The cult spread throughout the Mediterranean, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability of Egyptian mythology. However, this fusion did not withstand the test of time. Roman rule and, later, the spread of Christianity marked the end of the ancient cults. Temples were converted into churches, and knowledge of hieroglyphics was lost. For more than 1,400 years, the voices of the pharaohs remained silent, their inscriptions reduced to incomprehensible symbols. That silence was broken in 1799 with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The slab contained the same text written in hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek, and it was the key that allowed Champollion to decipher the language of the ancient Egyptians. For the first time in centuries, the past spoke again. Discoveries such as the intact tomb of Tutankhamun confirmed that those beliefs were not mere legends. They were a profound, practical, and sacred system that gave meaning to life, death, and eternity. Ancient Egypt was reborn before the modern world. Its myths, like its pyramids, refused to disappear. Today they remain present in film, where pharaohs and mummies have become a genre of their own. From the 1932 film The Mummy to its more recent versions, figures like Anubis have become iconic. The story of Osiris, his death and resurrection, and the vengeance of Horus remains a universal narrative archetype. In literature, Egyptian mythology continues to inspire new generations. Authors like Rick Riordan with the Kane Chronicles have brought these tales to young readers, keeping a millennial tradition alive. The fascination with life, death, and the afterlife transformed Egyptian mythology into an immortal legacy, capable of transcending centuries and continuing to inspire awe. A final journey down the Nile that never ends. In these books, the gods and beings of ancient Egypt are brought to bear on the challenges of the modern world. The journey to the underworld, the do-it, remains a recurring motif in contemporary fantasy. Video games have also drawn upon this heritage. Franchises like Assassin's Creed Origins not only reproduce monuments with extraordinary detail, but also incorporate the gods and their beliefs into the player experience. It is possible to explore temples of Ammonius Ra and observe how daily life was steeped in ritual. Even card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Have made the ancient gods some of their most powerful cards, a recognition of the grandeur attributed to them for millennia. In contemporary art, Egyptian iconography remains relevant. The Eye of Horus is today a symbol of protection and mystery, and the pyramids and sarcophagi remain emblems of power and enigma. The fascination with this civilization stems from its ability to propose a complete universe, where every gesture and every image responds to a higher order. Even with the passage of time, modern culture finds in the Nile and its myths an inexhaustible source of meaning for addressing the great questions of existence. If this exploration of Egyptian mythology has been extensive, it is because its history is not limited to narrating divine feats. It was a meticulous system, constructed with the same precision as its temples, offering a coherent way of understanding life. Beyond the visible ruins, the true legacy is the symbolic cosmos they designed. They did not venerate death out of obsession, but because they believed that earthly existence was only the beginning of a greater journey. In the Nile, in the daily rebirth of the sun, and in the stories of Osiris, the Egyptians sought a purpose and a beauty that would endure in the face of chaos. What remains in the end is the image of a culture that united the human and the divine. They understood that a river could be a god, that a pharaoh could embody justice, and that a heart, when weighed against a feather, could define the destiny of a soul. I hope this story has kept you company and brought you some peace while you listen to a good tale. This is Sleepy History, your faithful companion on long nights. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a like and subscribe to become part of this nocturnal and cultured community. Thank you for being here. Until the next adventure.